All right, so I want to welcome everyone again to this session. This evening's webinar is the second in a series of online programs on contemporary Islam that is sponsored by the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Islamic Studies program. My name is Anna Mudd. I'm the curriculum coordinator at the Outreach Center at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard, which is co-sponsoring this event. You'll see, in addition to Dr. Cesari, who is with us, we also have Christina Friedlander of the Islamic Studies program, and she will also be moderating tonight. So Christina, do you want to just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the program?
Sure. So I'm Christina Friedlander. I'm the program assistant at the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Islamic Studies program. And our program supports Islamic studies at Harvard University, and we reach out to other universities to try to create a culture of Islamic studies in the Boston area. We do a lot of graduate student support and programming. So we've had a wide variety of programming this year, and we're looking forward to further programming this fall. And we support 4 chairs in Islamic, or 4 professorships in Islamic studies, and we're watching those fill. And I think that's about it.
Great.
You're welcome.
So the series began last week with a discussion on political Islam in the changing Arab world. And I think as that session attested, this online format, really provides an exciting opportunity for quite a diverse audience, including educators, other members of the community, educators at many grade levels, to engage with the expertise of scholars at Harvard. It's really been a wonderful interchange. So once again, I think we did this earlier, but I'm going to ask for people just to write in the chat box, just at this point as we're recording, just to write where you are broadcasting from, and then any sort of institutional affiliation that you have, either a school that you teach at or anything else that brought you here. So even if you've previously done this, if you could repeat that, that would be great. So Christina and I have just put ours up, so people just perhaps as we're going along, if you could add those, that would be wonderful. And welcome, Nizar just joined us. Nizar, we're just putting into the chat box our location from which we're broadcasting and our affiliations, institutional affiliations, just to get a little bit of a sense of who's in this conversation with us. So this evening's session is titled Religious Pluralism in France, Muslim Veiling and Citizenship, and we are pleased to be discussing another critical and engaging topic related to contemporary Islam, which will highlight larger questions of religion and democratic citizenship, as well as religious pluralism and identity. We are remarkably pleased to have Dr. Jocelyne Cesari with us this evening. Dr. Cesari is a political scientist specializing in the Middle East and Islamic studies. She is director of the Interfaculty Islam in the West program at Harvard University, a research program which authored the Encyclopedia of Islam in the United States, a major publication which was published by Greenwood Press in September of 2007. Her areas of expertise include Islam and globalization, Muslim minorities in Europe and America, and Islam and politics in North Africa. Dr. Cesari has published 13 books and more than 50 articles in European and American journals. Her most recent books are When Islam and Democracy Meet, Muslims in Europe and in the United States, and European Muslims and the Secular State. And just a reminder once again, as I was saying before, that we intend for this to certainly be an interactive session. So Dr. Cesari will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have the opportunity to engage and ask questions. So you're welcome both following her presentation to ask questions by coming up on the screen. You can put on your video. We'll talk about how to do that after, or ask with your microphone. You're also welcome during the presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can type them into the chat box that you've all been using just now. And we can either, Christina and myself will monitor that and see if there are repeated questions, or we also just bring those questions to the fore after the presentation. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to this. And Dr. Cesari, I'm going to turn it over to you at this point. so you just need to turn on your microphone.
Hi, thank you to the Outreach Center of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and also to the Prince bin Talal Islamic Studies program for organizing this session. And welcome to all of you who are already there or joining us. So my presentation will be on the recent ban of the face veiling in France and what it means, because for an American audience, such a complete legal prohibition of specific type of clothing has raised a lot of questions. And I would like first to start and organize my talk about or around the difference between the banning of the face veil that just happened this year, actually implemented last April, and was voted in July of 2010, but came into effect this April. And usually in America, people tend to see it as a continuation of the ban of religious signs in public schools that happened also in France in 2004. And I think it's important to make a difference here between the two laws. They are not a continuation of each other, meaning in the sense that there is a clear differentiation between the law of 2004 that was explicitly prohibiting all religious signs in public schools, meaning that what was at stake is the visibility of religions in the space of a classroom considered as a public space. Of course, we all know that the hijab was the major culprit or object or target of this ban, but everybody was concerned, including people wearing the yarmulke or people wearing the Sikh turban, and all the cases came up actually after the law was voted. So it's important to keep this in mind. While the recent law of banning the face veil, even if in the term, again, cannot explicitly target the niqab, and I will explain the difference between these two terms, hijab and niqab. Even if the niqab is not mentioned as such, everybody knows that the law clearly and explicitly targets the niqab. So let me first explain the difference between the two. The hijab is part of the dress code for Muslim women who observe what's called the modesty rules in the Islamic practice, which means that, and usually people do not take the bigger picture into account, but in Islam there is a codification of gender relations that tend to create not a segregation automatically as some people would think of, but a differentiation and a distinction in the sense that women and men have to dress modestly and have to interact modestly. And among these rules on modesty, for women there is a covering and also dressing in a certain way. So the covering in the main dominant Sunni orthodoxy concern the hair, the breast, or the arms up to the wrist, and also the legs up to the ankle. So the face in the mainstream orthodoxy is not usually considered as an obligation to cover. So the niqab, as it's used by women in some parts of Muslim countries, or even the burqa, if you think of some practices in Afghanistan, is something that is not directly imposed or codified as an obligation of modesty rule for women, but come from other practices. It happened that in some more conservative interpretation of Islam, and I'm thinking of the Wahhabi tradition or interpretation that is dominant in Saudi Arabia, for example, or the face covering or niqab has become part of the mandatory prescription. But again, it has never been the case all over the Muslim world, to the point that people tend to forget that besides the French case, there has been a debate recently in Muslim majority countries about the niqab itself. In Egypt, before the social movement or protest of the spring, the main topic of discussion in Cairo was about the niqab, and the Grand Mufti of Egypt took even position condemning the wearing of niqab by Egyptian women, saying that this was not part of the Egyptian Islam. Same thing in Syria, where the niqab was actually banned. I think the ban has been lifted a few weeks ago, again before the appraisal. So this is a debate, again, that should not be seen as a sort of incompatibility between Islamic prescription and the West, in the sense that it's also in debate in Muslim majority countries as well. So that's why you cannot take as such a sort of continuity or linear logic between the 2004 law in France banning religious signs in public school and the current law banning the niqab. So what are the other differences here? Maybe before I move on to the specific situation of the niqab, let me give you, because again this may not be so obvious to an American audience, the specificity of laïcité, which you could translate in English as the French regime of secularity. And this specificity of laïcité does explain the 2004 law prohibiting all religious signs in public school. What does this mean? It means that, and I am very aware how strange it may sound to an American audience, that in France there is a very harsh separation between private and public. I'm not talking about separation of church and state. In this regard, the US legislation is very similar to the French legislation. What I'm explaining here is the perception of the role of status of religion in social life and public space. And in this regard, the French consider lots of religious activities in public space as illegitimate, while it is not the case in the US. And this goes back to a few historical features that have to be explained. The first one concerns the fact that in France, and I would say even across Europe, in this regard it's not only France but all over Europe, religion is seen as a troublemaker. The French learn at a very young age in schools that religious difference can create civil war. For example, we learn in the textbook a very traumatic event where Catholic and Protestant fought, and actually there was a massacre of Protestants. It's called the Saint-Barthélemy, by the name of a saint of this day. And so there is the idea that the state, at the time the king, has to protect the citizens against assassination, disorder coming from religious differences that cannot be accommodated without the regulation of the state. So in this regard, the state takes a central role in controlling, in codifying, but also in pushing religion out of the public space. So this is something, again, that is at the opposite of the vision of religion in the American history, where, after all, most of the citizens who came to this country, or immigrants, especially in the early stages, came with the hope to escape from religious persecution in Europe, and therefore they saw the U.S. as a heaven, to be possible to express themselves on religious grounds. So it's very different from France. So there is deep down in the French public culture a resistance, suspicion toward religion, seen as again a cause of social disorder and public or political unrest. And I think it's important to keep this in mind. This idea of religion as troublemaker will continue until the building of modern France, which happened after the French Revolution, and that will culminate with the separation of church and state in 1905. And at this moment, there is still a strong tendency or necessity to fight against the Catholic Church. Also, the French specificity has been a close connection between the dominant church, in this case the Catholic Church, and the state, to the point that it was almost impossible before the separation of 1905 to distinguish what was the domain of the church, what was the domain of the state. And at the time, the Catholic Church is seen as a major enemy against the creation of a democratic state. The Republicans in France, not to confuse with the Republican in the US, in France it refers to the generation of the founder of the French democratic state, had to fight against the Catholic hierarchy that didn't want the creation of a democracy, but wanted France to remain a traditional monarchy associated with all the other monarchies around in Europe. And so the separation came as a necessity to avoid the continuous political influence of the Catholic Church on the political development of France. And so again, the idea here is that religion is incompatible with democracy, is incompatible with the creation of a new generation of citizens that act rationally. So there is a lot of idea here on religion as anti-democratic, as backward, as anti-science, as an obstacle to build rational minds. And so it explains very clearly why, besides the separation of the church and state, the first move or initiative of the Republicans, of the founders of the French democracy, was to create a public school. Because also at the time, the Catholic Church was the main educator in France. There was no school that were public. If you wanted to go to school, you had to go to a school run by nuns or priests. So the French Republicans decided to create a public school that was free and mandatory for everybody. And the rule was that no religion could take advantage and express itself or use the school as a tool to what the French call indoctrinate, to create a sort of influence on the new generation. So you understand why then Islam became such a sensitive topic when women, young women, French citizens, came to school wearing the hijab, because all other religions, actually, before Muslims became so visible in French public space and in society in general, all other religions and religious groups went through a transformation of their usual way of dealing with social interaction, with public space, under the strong influence of the separation of church and state and the building of a new culture where to be a good citizen in France is to limit your religious expression to two places, your home and your place of worship, which means your temple or church or synagogue. So it's not that other religions are different than Islam. It means that the other religion went through a process of accommodation where people tended to withdraw from being visible in public space because there are consequences. It didn't mean that you were put in jail or fined, but it meant that you went through a process of social judgment that was not automatically in your favor. You could also go through some kind of discrimination. People wearing the yarmulke was not automatically welcome in some kind of job. It was not the way you could really have a political life if you wanted one. There were lots of professions, lots of social activities that you could not really get into if you were showing too much religious signs. And again, this is this vision that religion is not welcome in the civic pact in France. The Muslims were not part of this transformation. You know, it took 50 years between the law of 1905 instauring the separation. And I would say that the transformation, majority of Catholics, the majority of French are remain and were at the time Catholic. You had Protestants and Jews. These were the three major groups. It took most of them, and especially the Catholics, 50 years to change their behavior and to accept the separation in this sense. And again, I'm not talking here about a legal separation. I'm also talking about this accommodation, acceptation that religion is private as much as possible. It's interesting to note that at the time of separation in 1905, Islam of France is actually a major Muslim country, because at the time France is a colonial power, meaning covering and controlling lots of Muslim countries, and among them Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. And at the time Algeria is French, meaning Algeria is divided in three départements, we call this in France, Department Algiers, Constantine and Oran, and they were like Marseille or Lyon or Paris. So legally the separation of church and state should have applied to Islam too in Algeria. Paradoxically or ironically, it didn't. The French state decided not to provide independence or separation to Islamic institutions. And it's not because the religious authorities didn't ask. They did ask. They actually claimed or requested strongly the separation, but the state didn't. So you see, this is part of the inconsistency between, I would say, the spirit of the law, the legal implementation of the law, and the political control that the French state wanted to keep on the Muslim population in the colony. So when the Muslims became an important, significant religious minority in France in the 70s and 80s, they were present on the French territory as, you know, as a consequence of an immigration history that again goes back very early in the relationship between the former colony and France. Between the two world wars, you have already Muslims from the Maghreb, meaning Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, coming to France. And after the Second World War, and after the independence of all these countries between the 50s and 1962, 1962 is the independence of Algeria, you have an increase of the migration flows. And people start becoming much more active in building mosques, creating halal butcheries, claiming for Islamic cemeteries in the late 70s, early 80s. In 1989, this is the beginning of what's called the headscarf crisis. 3 young women go to public school wearing a hijab, a headscarf, and then started the discussion about the legitimacy of this kind of religious covering in the public school, which is considered in France a public space that should be removed or maintained as free as possible from religious signs. And you have a lot of debate at the time. In the beginning of the crisis in the 90s, the Conseil Constitutionnel, which you can define like the Supreme Court in the US, took a lot of positions that were very tolerant, actually, vis-à-vis the hijab, saying that the principle of neutrality applied to the teacher, but not to the students, unless there is a major issue of tension or fight in the classroom or in the school. There is no reason why the students should not wear what they want to wear. And these kind of decisions were highly discussed and questioned by high school teachers themselves, who didn't accept such a conclusion, by politicians, by women's groups. Lots of feminist groups were very and are still very vocal on the question of the hijab and see it as a sign of oppression of women, not taking into account that a lot, not to say the majority of the women who wear the hijab from the new generation in France wear it because they want it, not because it's imposed on them by men, brothers or fathers. But this didn't really come as an important or influential argument in the debate. It's also very astonishing that the commission called the Stasi Commission that prepared all the material that will lead to the law of 2004 actually didn't interview a lot of young women wearing the hijab, which already tells you the bias here. Not to mention that there is no reason for a law in the sense that the majority of young women in France do not even wear the hijab. We are not talking here about a mass phenomenon. We are talking about a minority of young women. And again, the public discourse was to present them as a growing majority, showing the oppression of on women by Muslim men, which again was far removed from the sociological reality. So the law of 2004 was an attempt by the French government to bridge the gap, I would say, between the cultural, the dominant perception of the French, which is to consider as suspicious any visible religious sign in public space. So if Muslims decide to maintain some kind of dress code that impinge on the public space, it means that they are not civic or citizen enough. And at the same time, the Conseil Constitutionnel, or the Supreme Court of France, was saying there is nothing in this dress code that is violating the separation of church and state or the laïcité, the French regime of secularity. But it was at some point not possible to maintain this gap between these two versions, and you had a lot of discussion among intellectuals, scholars, politicians, which kind of laïcité can we agree on. and because the side of the what's called in French the hard line of the laïcard, meaning the people who want a very strong rejection of religion in public space, and a lot of them are very vocal and popular, and it doesn't go with the right and left political distinction. It cuts across right and left. Where the most dominant group, the most vocal one, the feminist group, the high school teacher, all these explain why the law was voted. Again, so you can explain the 2004 law prohibiting, again, all religious signs. We are not talking here only about the hijab. We are talking about the visibility of religious signs in public schools, meaning that it did create problems for observant Jews. It did create problems for Sikhs that were not at all even taken into account in the discussion. But this came at the forefront, and the response of the state was, sorry, you are all under now the same limitation. Interestingly, since the law of 2004, it's important to note a few things. First, most or all actually of the Muslim religious groups in France asked the young women to respect the law. Even if they were wearing the hijab, if they wanted to go to public schools, they had to remove the hijab in the classroom space. Okay. And they did it. There are not a lot of cases of, contesting or trying to break the law. So this is one important point to notice. The second point is when the young women didn't want to remove the hijab in the classroom, they had two options, and actually they used the first one very much. They went to private schools. There are very few Islamic private schools in France. Actually, since 2004, a few have been created to accommodate these young students and young women. But most importantly, a lot of these women went to Catholic private schools because the law of 2004 does apply to public schools, but not to private schools. So you can wear the hijab in any private school in France. And there's been an increase of Muslim students in Catholic private schools that are the dominant in terms of number of private schools in France. So this is also interesting to note. So this is the law of 2004. The French law is a specificity in the European context. There have been debates about wearing the hijab outside France, of course. The other country that has a debate on the legitimacy of the hijab is Germany, but it doesn't concern the students. France is the only country where students wearing the hijab have been put under this constraints or limitation of dress code. Otherwise, across Europe, it's not the case. The Germans have a different situation because, as you know, the education law are part of the federal system, so each state has its own law, but there are more and more states that have adopted the ban of the hijab for the teachers. It is also very, very contested in Germany, and it does create a lot of tension about, the Muslim teachers and their position in school. But again, banning the hijab for students has never been a topic of discussion or controversy. So this is also the specificity of the 2004 law in the sense that it has not happened at the same level, same intensity across Europe. So you see how it's difficult for an American audience to understand what it means. So in a nutshell, the sensitivity of the French towards the hijab goes back to an historical sensitivity toward the role of religion in public space, toward the condition of separation of church and state, and the fact that the Catholic Church and in general any religion is seen in France as anti-democratic and backward and a threat to democracy. And third, the specific vision or negative approach of the hijab in itself, that it's seen as a sign of women oppression. So these three reasons cumulated will have led the French to this 2004 law. The niqab debate, again, the niqab is the face veiling. The niqab debate is slightly different in the sense that everywhere in Europe, not only in France, everywhere in Europe there is a question on the niqab. Actually, it started a few years ago when the Minister of Interior in the UK, Jack Straw, made a comment because he had a delegation of young women wearing the niqab, and he said that he was very uncomfortable to talk to his visitors without seeing their faces. And I think this sparked a debate on how do you interact in a liberal secular democracy, and what does it mean about some kind of prescription you would like to follow in this new context, and what does it say about your capacity of being part of mainstream society even if you are Muslim. So all these questions have been very strongly debated about the niqab in France, in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Spain, everywhere. But again, the French are the only ones for now. Actually, there are a few legislation in the making, I think in Belgium, probably in Spain, about banning the niqab in different circumstances. But the French have been the first in creating such a law. So why the niqab now? I mean, the law of the niqab against the niqab is more related to the general trend over Europe, and actually you are also seeing it in the US now, at least since the last 2 years, with the debate on the Ground Zero Mosque, the debate on Sharia. There is a greater sensitivity about issues of security and activities of Islam. In other words, all questions of visibility or management of Islam in public space involved now or are related to question of security of citizens. And so the niqab is seen as an obstacle to prevent or maintain a minimum of security, which again is not proved by any survey. Actually, there was again a new commission in preparation of the law, and they could not come up with any serious survey so showing that wearing the niqab is actually associated with a greater risk of terrorism. And I think this is important to keep in mind, but it doesn't matter. The point is that politically, banning the niqab was a move or a political act that was pleasing a lot of citizens that didn't feel comfortable with the interaction of people or young women that you could not see. And again, with the idea what's going on underneath. Is this an enemy or friend? And this perception is, again, something you can perceive all across Europe, not only in France. And it's interesting to relate this increased debate on Islamic signs and security issue with other events that happened in Europe before that. If you think of the minaret debate in Switzerland, it's exactly the same logic. The minaret is an Islamic attribute of the mosque. It has been described and discussed in the Swiss context and beyond as incompatible with the public space because it is associated as a possible risk of threat on the citizens. And I think there is no rational ground to such a threat, but it is very emotional and very powerful to create this anti-Islamic feeling or sentiment or discourse that now is called everywhere Islamophobia, and lots of politicians, not only the right wing actually in France, are instrumentalizing it in their relationship with citizens. And it's now exactly the same thing in the US. In the last 2 years, this continuous association between Islamic presence in public space and threat or security issues has come very strongly. Beyond the Ground Zero Mosque, there is a movement in the US trying to limit or prohibit the creation, the building of Islamic centers. There is a movement that tries to ban Sharia from state legislation where there is no reason or even fair about Sharia in this country. So you see that this kind of Islamophobic approach, again, that is much more related to the post-9/11 and to the security context, much more than to the question of secularity as such. While, again, the law of 2004 in France was much more in connection with French specificity of secularity. So let me finish on one point, because I think it's a point that we could also pursue in the discussion. The niqab has never been debated in another under another angle or perspective, which I would like to bring to close up the presentation here, and that indeed the complete face covering is a challenge for secular democratic spaces. Why? Because it is incompatible as such with the kind of face-to-face encounters that are constitutive of the citizenship status. Think of it. You cannot vote if you are not identified. You cannot take part in any public debate or mobilization. You cannot act as a legitimate citizen in different circumstances if you do not show your face. It's a basic assumption, not assumption even, but rule that makes you participate in the agora, in the forum as an equal with others. And I think this is important to keep in mind, meaning that it is not saying that, Islam is uncivic. It is saying that some prescriptions or some interpretation of Islam in the secular democratic context may not be accommodated and cannot be accommodated. And I think this is something we can open up for discussions. And you can argue that it may not need a complete legal ban. And I think this is what I call the French excess or the legal fetishism. The French tend to think that if you create a law, you change the mind, which is obviously or rarely not the case. But even in the US, there have been cases where wearing the niqab has become an issue in some kind of job, in some kind of interaction. And the American way, unlike the French way, is not to ban completely, especially not in the street, but to limit case by case, because there is a stronger jurisprudence, I would say, on how to facilitate or to regulate or make possible religious activities in the US, which is not the case in France. There is a very weak jurisprudence about religious freedom and the conditions to experience religious freedom in France. Just to wrap up on that, it is really regrettable that by linking Islam and security, the real issue of integration of Islamic practices within secular democratic space are not really addressed. And in this sense, I do not think that a complete prohibition is the most efficient response to the few Muslim women who chose to adopt indeed a lifestyle that may be seen as illiberal in the midst of liberal democracies. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Cesari. That was extremely thought-provoking. So we do have time now to engage in some question asking and discussing. So there's two ways that you can do this. One is if you want to come up on screen, I would encourage you to hit the little hand raise button, which is the hand with the green arrow directly below the participants. And then we'll acknowledge you, and then you can turn on your microphone by clicking on the icon on the lower left. And also, if you would like, hitting the transmit button underneath the videos. If you would like to come up on video, that would be great. Additionally, if you would like, you can also just type questions or responses into the chat box for us to look at. So it looks like we do. Miriam, do you want to come up on screen? Or do you want us to just read from the chat box? Yes, that's fine. We'll just read it. So Miriam says, thank you so much for this great talk. I have a question. Do you believe that this recent law in France is mostly based not on security perspective, which is what the French government claims, but more on the government Sarkozy's anti-Muslim sentiments? Dr. Cesari, you just have to turn your mic back on.
Not only Sarkozy anti-Muslim sentiments. There have been a lot of polls showing that all French, right and left, are opposed to the niqab. So it is not something that is, I would say, a specificity of the Sarkozy government. This is a big, unanimous position among the French. And they have seen it not only as a reaction or a way to protect the security of French citizens, but it has also been discussed as a way to protect French identity. And it has been crafted in these terms, meaning if you want to be in France as a French citizen, you have to comply to certain rules, including in the way you dress. And this, again, was already present in the 2004 law prohibiting the hijab, but it became even more so in the niqab debate. And I think you may not know that, but try to understand that for the French it's a very emotional topic. It is not something that they discuss rationally. There have been cases of women wearing the niqab being attacked in the French street by other women. And women, especially, have been very, very aggressive against this kind of dress code. So we are here touching on something that is also something to do with the status of women and modern French women in public space. There has been a very small video, you may have heard about it. It's called Niqab Beach. And it shows two young women wearing the niqab, but walking in the street of Paris with short pants or hot pants, I don't know how you call it. So having their legs completely bare and showing, you know, wearing very tight and short pants, hot pants. You see what I mean. I don't have the video with me. And you should have seen the reaction of the French. They liked it. In the sense they saw it as, oh yeah, this is, so in France being an independent, empowered woman is also to be able to show your body. And it's something that, again, is very at odds with the American conception of women dignity, or the discourse of the feminist movement here in the country, in the US. So it's not only an anti-Sarkozy instrument or feeling of Sarkozy against Islam. It's much more deeper than that.
Okay, great. We have another question sort of touching again on this question of individualism. So Akbar says, I might be wrong, but my understanding is that the niqab is not an Islamic law, but a practice that women choose to practice based on their own choice. So in a way, the law is not against Islam, but against individualism itself. Am I correct in saying that? Sorry, the microphone again. I've been turning it off.
It's a little more complicated than just a practice that women choose to adopt. It is something that is part also of the legal discussion among scholars. As I said, the niqab has been codified as mandatory by the Wahhabi clerics. Wahhabis being the doctrine, the official doctrine of the Saudi kingdom, but it has become also a global doctrine and has influenced across the Muslim world, or even in the West. It's called the Salafi interpretation. And it does go with the idea that the modesty rules include also the covering of the face, the covering of the hands. So it's not just that women decide to do it. It's also related to a vision of Muslim orthodoxy that some decide to follow, but there are also clerical positions for that. And it's very, very much in discussion among clerics themselves. So, it's like having a discussion between fundamentalist and more secular approach in any kind of religious tradition. So it's not just a practice, it is also at the core today of what is Muslim orthodoxy, what is wrong and what is right, what is acceptable and not acceptable, negotiable, non-negotiable in the Islamic tradition. So it's a little more than I decide to do it because it's how I want to live.
Great. It looks like John has his hand up. So John, if you want to just turn on your microphone, again, click on the icon on the bottom left, and then also if you want to come up on video, feel free to do that.
Is that me? It's John 1. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
You can hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so I guess a double kind of question. One is this issue a live political issue today in France and anticipated in the upcoming kind of presidential or other elections? And particularly, is the Muslim community itself involved politically in it? And what about women's organizations, so women leaders both in the Muslim world and in among feminist, so-called feminist groups in the broader society?
Thank you, John, for your question. Obviously, the question of Islam will be very important in any election, not only in France but across Europe. It's obviously, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
It's obviously central in the way that Europeans, not only French, try to define themselves as citizens in a new political context with the creation of the European Union, with the redistribution of power between the level of the European Union and the level of the different states. The discussion is everywhere about the failure of multiculturalism, the fact that Islam may not be easy to integrate in the different political or legal institutions, because besides the niqab debate, you have also a Sharia debate. So I think that this will play a very, very strong role in any kind of political campaign, and it is already. It's not, prediction, it's happening right now. And I do not see why it should go away in the next year. Like, actually, it's going to be on the agenda for a long time. And Muslims are involved in this process. Not as much as they should, but you have a lot of young Muslims. You have more and more an active Muslim middle class, and they try to play a role in the political debate. Interestingly, they do not create Islamic parties, which would be something you could consider. If you think that they are uncivic, they may build Islamic parties. Actually, there are a few, but they have no followers. Most of Muslims, when they want to do politics, do it in the mainstream institution, which is interesting. And despite that, they are seen as not good citizens, while even when they participate in political life, they do not adopt a separatist attitude. So there is something here very intriguing, because I didn't insist on that in my talk because it was too much, but most of the data we have when we survey Muslims across Europe shows that they identify very highly to their country, France, Germany, the UK, that they trust the institution more than the non-Muslim citizen, that they praise the democratic system, that they are very happy to be there, despite, again, all these tensions. So it's very interesting to see that this kind of attitude is not taken into account in any discussion about Islam. And I think it's a danger, because it does open bigger the gap between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. About Muslim women in the Muslim world, I think it's another question, and of course they are active. They have been very active even in the Arab Spring that happened and is still unfolding under our eyes. Women have played an important role, and they will continue to play an important role, and they are at the forefront of not getting rid of Islam. Again, this is a false perception, but revisiting the Islamic tradition to create greater space for women, not only in the family, but also in political activities, in social activities. And this is very interesting to see this kind of debate happening. I just said that there is a very strong contestation about what is the true Islam, what is the Orthodox Islam, and Muslim women are at the forefront of this debate, not only as object of the controversy, but also as agent actors to change the rule. And again, not to get rid of Islam. I think this is an important point to keep in mind. Their model is not to become the secular Western women, but to readjust the rule in a way that allows them to be Muslim, to be women, and to be equal with men.
So we are just at 8 o'clock. I'm wondering, we had one more question, John Lamb, who raised his hand before. Dr. Cesari, since we started a couple minutes late, would you be all right with taking one more question? Okay, we'll do, and I understand that others may need to leave, so that's fine. But John Lamb, if you want to just turn on your mic very quickly to ask your question.
Yes, it's really more in the nature of a comment. In terms of Syria, which Doctor had mentioned earlier, I think it was in 2010 that students at both public and private universities in Syria were prohibited from wearing the niqab. And I know at one point all teachers employed by the Ministry of Education were prohibited from wearing the niqab, although they were allowed to work in administrative positions, but outside of the classroom. And a few weeks ago, and after the beginnings of the demonstrations, I think as an effort to appeal to some Muslim sentiments, at least it was announced that those teachers would get their classroom positions back. But what happens in terms of the government's attribution of many of the disturbances to the Salafis, what happens to that permitting of the niqab on teachers remains to be seen. I'd also just like to say that for other Americans here, in terms of the French concept of laïcité, the strength of it is so extraordinary because I think it was in 1880 that France suppressed all religious orders, the Jesuits first of all, but actually all religious orders. And ironically, it probably helped French missionary activity in various parts of the world, because I think even the most ardent secularist said the anticléricalisme n'est pas un article d'exportation. You know, anti-clericalism is not for export, because we know that all of these religious teachers actually enhance French cultural prestige abroad. And just the final comment was in terms of the U.S., I think the niqab has certainly been banned from people who have tried, women who have tried to wear the niqab for their driver's license pictures. That has been prohibited. Also for women trying to testify in a court, because it's traditionally been something in American jurisprudence that the ability of jurors to look at a witness and get a sense from their facial features as to the honesty of their testimony has always been considered very, very important. So in that context too, the wearing of the niqab has been prohibited.
Excellent. They do add a little more background. Thank you for that. There is one question on the chat box. Can I address it briefly from, I think it's Miriam, about the one on Turkey. I don't know if any a question on Turkey. No, it's Elizabeth. Sorry. Elizabeth, actually you have a good point here, Elizabeth. I think that the issue concerning the inclusion of Turkey in the EU is exactly related to this resistance to Islam. There have been a lot of debate among European states and leaders. What is the identity of this new entity we are trying to build? If we are all secular, liberal democracies, so what kind of historical background are we building on? And a lot of them, including French, paradoxically, have brought up the question of the Christian heritage. And I think this is something why Turkey may not make it in the European Union, because the people and leaders in this new entity see it as a Christian entity.
Excellent. Well, we're now just about at 10 after 8, so I want to thank everyone for their really astute questions and contributions. And again, of course, once again, thank Dr. Cesari for her presentation, which was excellent. There will be a recording of this session available, which we will make available to you, and we hope to alert you to future such programs. But for now, good evening, and thanks for attending.
Evening to all. Thank you. Bye.